Our program this evening is a book discussion of The Woman's Hour, The Last Furious Fight to Win the Vote by Elaine Weiss. Our discussion facilitators tonight are Elaine Fisher, a member of the Jane Addams and Northwest Suburban branches, and Harriet Lindstrom, a member of the Downers Grove area branch, the Jane Addams branch, and the League of Women Voters. During this program, you will be muted, so please type any technical issues or questions you have into the chat box and raise your hand to speak. You raise your hand using the participants menu on your device. Please wait to be recognized. As Kate said, we have a lot of people tonight, and that way we're not talking over one another. We have lots of participants, so we'll get to as many of you as we can. Also, you are being recorded tonight, and we will post this recording on the Jane Addams branch website. Please remember that AAUW is a nonpartisan organization. Please also keep your comments nonpartisan. I will now turn the program over to Elaine Fisher.
Hello, let's begin with some historical background. In 1878, the amendment was first introduced to give women the right to vote, and for the next 40 years, it was reintroduced regularly, becoming known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Women were told to wait until after the Civil War and after the abolition movement freed the slaves. Then in 1914, World War I began, and the women were told to wait again. Women supported the country in the war effort in hopes that they would be rewarded with the right to vote as citizens. In 1918, there was the Spanish flu pandemic. But also in 1918, President Wilson changed his position to the support of the suffrage amendment. Finally, in June 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed by the U.S. Congress. However, next it would need to be ratified by 35 states. 15 states had previously provided the vote to women in their state. And by the end of 1919, 22 states had ratified the 19th Amendment. However, also in 1918, Georgia became the first state to reject certification or ratification of the 19th Amendment. And other southern states also rejected the amendment: Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, plus northern states, Delaware, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. By March 1920, 13 more states had ratified, making the total number of states to ratify 35 states. So one more state was needed. That was the 36 was the number needed to adopt the 19th Amendment. The only two states remaining were South Carolina and Tennessee. Tennessee was considered the last best chance because Tennessee had previously given women partial voting rights. So the story of the last furious fight to win the vote happened in Nashville, Tennessee during the August heat, kind of like today. That is the setting of the Women's Hour. And the key women leaders who arrived in Nashville were Carrie Chapman Catt from New York State, and she was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Sue White was an activist in the National Women's Party. She's originally from Tennessee, but she came from Ohio, where they had been lobbying the presidential candidates. and Josephine Pearson, the Tennessee State Association president of the group opposed to women's suffrage. And now let's take a look at some of the public sentiment on suffrage through some of the cartoons that appeared in the newspaper. Remember, at this time, you had telegraphs, newspapers, and flyers that were posted on fences, etc. No social media. But sentiment was high and emotions were quite dramatic. There were a lot of negative views of the suffragettes. Actually, the suffragists. Here's another. Oops. The American women had a choice: in the home or on the street corner. This could impact husbands' working hours and duties. There could be chaos on election day. And you notice the woman's attire. She's wearing a little tie. She's not quite as feminine as maybe she used to be. And it could be really dramatic and lead to perhaps marital troubles and arguments. So given that background, let's now hear about the author. Harriet?
Yes, and I also would like to welcome everybody. I understand we have quite a large group. We are going to work very hard to have some participation, so be patient with us as we go through some of these things. Elaine Weiss is an excellent writer, storyteller, researcher, and interviewee. In the Women's Hour, she writes about the tensions, the heat of the day, the struggle, the political intrigue, loss of family and friends, and determination of action. The timing of her book about the cause has helped many put in perspective how narrowly women earned the right to vote. And all we have to do here is think of Harry Burns and this remarkable story about Tennessee. The book is only about 6 weeks of time in Tennessee. As you can see, we have a local twist to the story. She graduated from Northwestern. And I think of note, the book has received the 2019 Silver Gavel Award for how the book furthers the American public's understanding of law. From one interview, and she has multiple interviews, she was set to write another book. She was going to research. She was in the Library of Congress and was going to research about the woman who gave a great deal of money to Alice Paul's group. But then she ran across this better story, 6 weeks in Tennessee to ratification. And there were all kinds of facets of politics there: race, class, money, gender, states' right, and power. And she found that far more fascinating. So in the summer of 1920, there was genuine uncertainty about the outcome of the vote. As we focus on women's right to vote during this anniversary time, she, along with others, have conceded disappointment that through the years, women have struggled for impact. Leaders of the movement who worked to ratify the 19th Amendment thought that a woman would be president in the very next election, and we know how that turned out. Elaine has pretty much covered this, but in the early part of the 1900s, the struggle for women's suffrage started to come together. And how did women get to this point? Well, in chapter 4 in the book, The Woman Question, women were repeatedly told, it isn't your time. After the Civil War, they were told it would be too much of a change for both Black emancipation and women getting the vote. Later, when the 15th Amendment enfranchised Black male voters, women were told to wait again. Suffrage leaders over the years learned that cultural changes happen over time. Public sentiment had started to be on their side with the advent of World War I, women working, public education, and the movement of the population to the industrial north, among other things. It was their time. As one reads the book and listens to her interviews, her desire to educate others is paramount. I'm talking about Elaine Weiss. The right for women to vote was a struggle. She challenges the myths that we had a bunch of enlightened men in Congress who just wanted to correct the wrong of one half of the population not having the right to vote, that all women wanted the right to vote, that it happened naturally in the first decade of the last century, and that all women could vote after ratification. We all know the struggle required 7 decades and 3 generations of persistent women. And also Jim Crow laws in the South prevented all women from voting. The book is really a larger look at how we've evolved as a democracy and reacted to those asking for inclusion. It chronicles one phase of changing we, the white wealthy men, to we, the people. It is one of the great civil rights campaigns in our nation's history. And of course, it became the model for many future movements in the quest for equality.
So now we'd like you to think about, imagine if you lived in 1915. Do you think you'd align yourself with NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association? Or would you join Alice Paul's group, the National Woman's Party? Or would you be attracted to the Antis? We're going to launch a poll and you can vote for one of these 3. Kate? You'll see these 3 choices appearing on your screen. Any moment now. Do I need to stop sharing my screen?
I'm having an issue. It may not work.
Okay, why don't we use the chat window? And choice A is the National Women's Suffrage Association. B is National Women's Party. And C is the Antis. If you could type in the chat A, B, or C, and Cynthia is going to monitor the chat so we can see where the majority lies. And remember, you're imagining you are living in 1915. Think about your family history and their role in society. What would be your options and which group would you choose to align with?
Wow, interesting.
Are the votes coming in, Harriet?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Probably more A's than B's, but it might be pretty even. What do you think, Cynthia?
A lot of A's and B's.
I don't see a C here.
Actually, it's I have 10 A's and 10 B's. Actually, one more A, maybe 11 A's and 10 B's that I've been counting so far. So it's pretty even.
And nobody for Antis?
No Antis that I could find.
Okay. Well, let's have someone speak to the NAWSA choice. Why, if you have strong opinions about why you chose that group, raise your hand and Cynthia will call on you.
How do you raise your hand?
It's in the participant choices, right? Or reactions. It depends on your device that you're on.
Oh,
It should be in a choice when you find yourself on the participant list.
We can hear you, so why don't you go ahead and talk?
Yes,
well, I raised my hand. I don't know what it's supposed to do. Do I
yes,
have to hit?
Cindy,
I hit that.
please speak.
Okay.
So
Well,
what-
I picked A for first because it said 1915, but I like to think the closer it got to 1918, 1919, and 1920, I would switch to B.
You would get impatient. That's a good point. Okay, let's see if we can find someone who chose B, who's willing to share.
And then Cindy, please lower your hand.
Okay, hold on.
Thank you.
And mute yourself again.
I'm trying. Hold on.
Okay.
We're all learning how to Zoom. Well, while we're waiting, I'm going to speak to the anti's view of the world.
Wait, can I interrupt you? Karen,
Sure, go ahead.
would like to speak
Sure.
for the other hand.
Oh, okay. As
Karen?
far as why I would choose B, I don't know. I think because just the more radical style, I guess, is just more that I, was how my way of thinking would be that, it would be, just to be that to get it through, you have to really use some more radical means, the way the National Women's Party did. Of course, they had to compromise their values too when they gave up their pacifist stance, and so yeah, it's hard to remember the timeline of which party did what when, but I think I would align more with the Women's Party because of they're were more assertive about what they wanted.
And this movement, remember, started in 1848. So depending on your level of patience, you might think, well, we need to try something new and different.
Definitely.
Yeah. However, the antis, the woman Josephine Pearson, she had made a promise to her mother that she would uphold this tradition of family and fulfilling the role of the woman as defined in the Bible. So that was their point of view, that this was going to change the role of women to the detriment of women, detriment of families. And they were quite adamant about it. They were devoted, you could say.
And it came from the Southern views on pro-slavery.
Well, I would remind everyone about the ERA campaign in Southern Illinois.
Right.
It could be.
If you want to hear one more opinion,
Sure.
okay, Patricia Spencer. I'm sorry, unmute yourself. There you go.
Myself.
There you go.
Unmute yourself. Unmute.
There? Okay.
Yes.
I had to do it two places. I thought that was a false choice because I saw the vote that PBS 4-hour series, and it may be this was their interpretation and that providing that choice to us was valid. It was they worked together it's a classic case of the 1-2 punch, because one became more dominant as the other's methods had to recede, and then vice versa. I thought it was a splendid case of alliances. I think the better crisis of choice would have been who would have supported the African American women wanting to forge forward, knowing that the South was so opposed to their having a voice and becoming softer on the white women getting the vote. The choice would have been, would you have stepped out and said, I'm not going unless my black sisters go too? Or would you say, let's hold back, let's get our amendment passed, and then we'll bring them on? To me, that would have been the more, that to me was more real. But again, I saw that show and it bent things that way for me. So thank you. I'll mute myself.
And we have to remember this was 1915. Also, wouldn't be from the eyes of us in this particular time.
Right, at that time. So moving on, leading right into this discussion, we've talked about the two branches of the American suffrage movement and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They were a little more using the traditional methods and lobbying and having meetings and telephoning people, newspaper reports, that type of thing. And Alice Paul was proposing radical ideas about demonstrating and parades, and she was actually kicked out of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. But the question kind of comes back to what Karen or Patricia said. Each group was effective in their own way. And we can probably move to the second question. In your opinion, why was one group more effective than the other? Or do you think one was more effective than the other? Let's see if we have anyone who wants to respond to that hasn't already spoken. Cynthia, do we have any hands raised?
Yes, Nancy Dietrich would like to speak.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just want to say that I kind of agree with what Patricia said. I also saw the vote and thought it was fabulous, and it really changed the way that my understanding of how the vote was won. And I do think that 1-2 punch, like she said, I kind of think they were both effective, because you had on the one, the more traditional route, but then you also had the more radical route, and doing both of them, I think they were both equally effective.
Okay, and then Barbara Schleicher would like to speak. Sorry, Barbara.
Hi, I agree with Nancy and what the other woman said. I think it was a 1-2 punch. I think that the National American Women's Suffrage Association were the political schmoozers, if you want to call it that. And then the women's group with Alice Paul as the leader was needed to get out there and demonstrate at the White House, have parades, even though they were jailed. Even in jailing, it was very important. So that's what I thought.
Thank you.
And then
They were both.
Gra would like to speak.
Go ahead.
Hey, it's Cindy. Yeah, wasn't one going with the national constitutional amendment, and the other one was going state by state?
Yes.
So a pressure in two different ways, and the national won. So obviously they were the most effective, but they both were putting pressure. So you can't, you can't. There's not a clear winner, but the national campaign won.
Well,
Right.
it was Kat's group that actually was doing the state by state at first. And Alice Paul never wavered. It was always supposed to be the national amendment. But in the end, I think they all came together on the national movement to get the amendment. They knew that they had to have that amendment.
Right. And there were certain things where they worked together as well. The NAWSA would send wires and telegrams and news reports, whereas the Women's Party would camp on the front porch or in the front yard in front of Harding's, the candidate for president, at his home. So they were more in your face, but they were pushing for the same thing that NAWSA was, but different methods. And they had different field organizers as well, but they both used that idea of a field campaign. And the NAWSA was getting pledges, and they had legislators signing them, and they thought that was a good way of keeping them aligned with their promise. However, that didn't always hold up in the long run, and other embarrassing kind of news reports had to be issued.
Do you want to hear from more participants?
Harriet?
Sure, one or two more, and then I do think we'll have to move on after that.
Right, let's do one or two more.
Mary Jo, I believe you wanted to speak. Do you want to unmute, please? Okay. Ann Gale.
Hi, I'm Ann. Carrie Chapman Catt's group had a lot more money to work with than Alice Paul's group. Her group received a bequest, and they had a lot more cash. You know, it allowed Carrie Chapman Catt to travel all over the country. In a way that Alice Paul could not. So just wanted to point that out.
I love the description. I think it was in the book. She was at a luncheon and got the phone call, and that's when she was told that she was going to inherit this estate. And in today's dollars, it would have been worth $50 million. So yes, they had a lot more money than Alice Paul. Alice Paul could not.
Meanwhile, Alice Paul was making phone calls trying to raise money,
Right.
which was why she wasn't in Nashville.
Right.
Ruth Bradburn. If you could.
I'm just curious, was there a difference in their age ranges on the two groups?
Yes, I think the younger women were in Alice Paul's, the Women's Party.
Yeah, they had to have more energy.
Well, probably that, but Sue White, who was from Tennessee, was leading the campaign in Tennessee. What had educated herself, became a working woman, supported herself, and
She became a lawyer.
that's what I think of as the young emerging professional woman would have been with Alice Paul, and the other were the wealthy women of the community, often that supported when they wanted the vote. I think we probably should move on.
Okay. And obviously we're talking about voting, and we treasure our self-image as a nation built on this bedrock of participatory democracy. But we're conflicted about who has the right to vote. How was voter suppression a factor in 1919? Well, we know for sure women were not allowed to vote. Alice Paul was even arrested for voting. And there were many others who were not allowed to vote in the South. the black man was supposed to have the right to vote. However, that wasn't always happening. So our question for you is, considering that tradition that every citizen needs to participate in a democracy, today, how do you think we consciously make it harder for some citizens to vote?
Hey, Marcus?
Well, you know, there's a very good YouTube it's called Suppression 2020, and it looks at what happened in Georgia during the gubernatorial election this past spring, and in Wisconsin. And we make it harder by closing polling places, by having people standing in line for hours and hours to vote. All those kind of things, and that's going on in a lot of states, in a lot of the southern states still. Also, when the Supreme Court changed the 1965 law, because they said that all these states, you know, were doing what they're supposed to be doing. Well, as soon as they changed that, many of those states started having all kinds of voter suppression tactics, like having to have a voter ID and a picture ID and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of that is still going on to suppress people of color, mostly.
And case in point,
People who might not have means, you know, if you don't have a driver's license or a photo ID, it's an extra thing you have to do and take time off work to get done in order to vote.
Karen Francis?
Hi, everybody. Hopefully everyone has seen the movie Rigged and the voter suppression playbook.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of things out there that are suppressing the vote, including here in Missouri. For the first time, people can vote by mail, but the ballots all have to be notarized and they all have to be delivered to the Board of Elections by the close of election. You can't just drop it off. So there are all kinds of issues surrounding voter suppression, and we all have to be aware of those.
Absolutely.
Karen Korsch?
Oh, well, my thoughts were that it just seems kind of crazy that, you know, when we're voting for a national office like the president and other national offices, that each state is allowed to make their own rules about who can vote, so that there's such a disjointed system as far as, you know, like the mail-in vote. Some states, everybody votes by mail. Some states, you have to have an excuse to vote by mail. Some states, you can choose, you know, which way you want to vote. So the disjointed system makes it so unfair. And to think that in this day and age that we have that kind of system where states, depending on which way their, you know, state government leans, they can put restrictions on how people vote.
That's a good point. Well, I think we need to move to the next slide.
here all night. This should look familiar to many of you, particularly the one with the pink hats. In the book that we were reading, all three organizations, Kat's group, Paul's group, and Pearson's anti-group, planned protests. And these took the form of marches and the visiting politicians to get promises and the twisting arms. They planned a lot of large group gatherings, created public relations for their cause. I was amazed at how they traveled across state and by train just at a whim. And they used the press, they raised money every place they went. And of course they involved the presidential candidates at the time, Harding and Cox. So this was a protest of a handful of remarkable women who led their respective forces into battle. And what they did was for us. These activists won their own freedom in one of the last campaigns coming out of the Civil War and the beginning of the great 20th century battles for civil rights. And I'd like to know now if there are a couple of participants who would be willing to talk about ways you've participated in a protest against government policies. And then did you suffer any consequences for your actions? And you talk about those. So do we have 2 or 3 people, Cindy, who might want to talk about?
Not yet.
Okay.
Mary Jo Walski. Mary Jo?
I know she's on a phone, so I don't know whether.
Yeah, but she's muted. So Mary Jo, if you could unmute. Otherwise, while she's unmuting, I'll go back to her. How about Kay Brocato?
Okay, Kay?
Hello. The question was about, have I participated in protests, and how or what were some of the ramifications of that? And we recently had in our local community a march after the George Floyd murder, and this had not as much to do with the women's right to vote, but it was a protest. And there was outrage in our local community about that, and many of us participated, and actually ended up being the largest protest in our community. And it also joined together our college campus in our city for the first time in history in a way that it had not been joined together. And since then, there have been some local groups who have really become very active in caring for underrepresented men and women, but primarily women who are economically disadvantaged. And so we've had these little cupboards that have popped up all over our community that women are going, that people are going to fill up, and then women and men go to those cupboards and take whatever they need. It's like a little tiny pantry. And so there has been some good reactions after that protest to meet people's needs. And then even this Saturday, there is a committee who will meet with our police officers to talk about systemic racism, systemic sexism, and trying to look at policy. So the movement is going on forward, and definitely the group celebrates women and suffrage and our right to vote now after this 100-year celebration.
Thank you. That's a wonderful thing and very, very recent. I don't think it doesn't have to be a protest for women's rights. It could be any kind of protest. What we're asking here. Are there any other people?
Yes, Mary Jo Walski, please.
Finally. I think I finally got to the place I could unmute. Hi, everybody. Okay, I'm afraid mine were all a long time ago, but I was chosen by the anesthesia department to be their representative during the Vietnam War to keep going to Washington every day that there was a bus that went to Washington for protest. And I also happened to work for the city of New York when that first women's march took place with Gloria Steinem and everyone. And I also was involved with the Poor People's March. And I would say that I never saw any kind of civil disobedience or any kind of clash with police at all. Everything I participated in was peaceful, and I believe that we thought at the time we were really making a big difference, and sometimes I feel like we're back to square one.
Right. Thank you, Mary Jo. Looks like we
You're
have somebody
welcome.
else.
I think we need
Jane Tuttle would like to speak.
Oh, yes. Back when I was much younger, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
Back when I was much younger, my first time I took part in a civil rights demonstration, I was teaching in a school district in northwestern Illinois, and we got a memo from our superintendent and and you know, everybody on down the line, that the teachers were not to take part in that demonstration. And I was very pleased to say that almost all the teachers in our district were out at that march. And that was the very first time I saw a solidarity of people standing up for someone else. We were standing up for a young Black man who had been illegally beaten up and jailed, and I'm very proud of that. And I think we need to see more of that, sticking up for each other instead of just what we want for ourselves.
And it seems to be happening, but it's becoming quite violent. Let's go to the next slide, because I think it takes it to another level. With what cause or injustice would you be willing to go to prison to protest? Now, in this particular movement back with the suffrage movement, it was Miss Paul, Alice Paul's group. She had the Sentinel group, and so anybody who got themselves put in prison got a pin from her, and then they also were rewarded by being able to be on a train but they could go cross country championing the cause of voting for women. So she was actually using prison as something that would help with this injustice. But would anyone want to speak to the fact, is there a cause that you would be willing to go to prison to protest? Or has anybody in our group been put in prison? Okay.
So let's move on.
Move on to religion. I think yes, because it's 8:22.
Wait, Barbara Snyder would like to speak.
Good. Well, let's have
Barbara.
Barbara.
Just really quick. Back in the 1969, I was marching in Washington against the Vietnam War, and I was one of the folks that was herded into the football stadium. But we also had tear gas, etc. And for a long time, I used to wear the pin, the dove pin, that had stains of the grass stains, etc., from being in there. But that was my big, you know, it was a prison basically. We were only kept for a few hours, but we were herded into it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So Elaine, you want to move on to this next group?
Okay. I think we touched on this a little bit before, that the religious arguments were used to warn people that expanding women's rights, including the vote, violated biblical teachings and went against God's plan for women. And if you were going to describe this plan, what would you say? And let's answer in the chat box on this one. We're trying to move forward because we have quite a few more slides to go through. But we'd like to hear How would you describe God's plan for women at that time in 1919?
Well, this was certainly one of the arguments of the anti-group.
Absolutely. Josephine Pearson had promised her mother she would fight the good fight for God's plan for women. Cynthia, are you seeing things in the chat?
No, nobody would like to comment at this time.
Okay. How about the next question then? Do you think religious rationales should be used to form public policy today? Would anyone like to speak to answer that question?
Faye Marcus.
Faye?
Well,
Unmute yourself.
there are religious groups that are trying to speak to women's right to choose. And that's why so much of this is happening among conservative voters, and the rules that are trying, and laws that are trying to be formed in some of the southern states, particularly the southern states that go against the woman's right to choose. So that is happening today, and I'm very much against that.
I agree that it's major.
Do we have anyone else?
Yes, if Ruth Bradburn could speak. Ruth, please unmute yourself.
Sorry. As far as I remember, we still have separation of church and state. And so I'm really confused as to how we let religion make our policy changes.
Thank you.
I think we're all aware of the current Department of Education diverting taxpayer funds for religious schools. That's another example that there's a blurring going on right now between public funds being used for religious purpose. Well, should we move to the next slide, Harriet?
Yes, why don't we? It's a little bit different tact. And we may move quickly through this because I'd like for you to, this was a question asked of Elaine Weiss in an interview that I watched. What parts of the book did you have the strongest emotional reaction to? And I think because of time, let's go on to the next slide and actually.
Well, do you want to give an example yourself and then I can give one? And then we'll go to the author's views.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, my reaction was to the way the legislators were treated by the lobbyists. Some were beat up and some of them were prevented from going home on the train. It got very physical. Life-threatening.
And I think some of my strong emotional reactions were to looking at what happened back with the political maneuvering and saying this law should apply and that law should apply, and that the interests of the alcohol and the railroad industries, it's no different. Wasn't any different back then as it is today. Why don't we go ahead? Yeah, this was her comment, and I think, I think it's more of a fact or an informational point. She felt that the courage of the suffragists, the bitter intensity of the racial, political dynamics, and the hypocrisy of the anti-suffrage arguments, that this was a very, very strong emotional reaction that she had. I think we could move on.
Okay. And this issue was raised earlier.
Well, were the suffragists correct in keeping their eyes on the prize? I think that both groups, I have read and I've seen it written that both, they said they both had a nigger problem, but they kind of overlooked some things, definitely overlooked it. And maybe part of their rationale was that they simply had to do that in order to get this passed. Our right to vote history focuses on really the white women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, two white women who are written about immensely in history. And they do present a very complete picture. Women of color, working class, and immigrant women also paved the way. And of course, there were some amazing leaders very, very early on in our country with the Native American women and the Latina and the Asian Americans. They were all working toward the broader struggle for equality. And in this particular book, there was one Black leader, Juna Frankie Pierce, who did cross the divide because she was Black and she was invited to give a speech in Nashville for actually Kat's group. And the meeting took place in the State House, and that was considered a very risky move. But both suffragist organizations, by and large, were white. And we have to keep the thought in mind that actually this suffrage movement was rooted, it came out of the abolitionist movement. So it is interesting that the white suffragists were the ones that probably ultimately got us the vote. Now, of course, pictured on this slide is our Chicago woman, Ida B. Wells. And she was an amazing suffragist who knew how to organize and protest nonviolently. And activists, Black and other minority groups were fighting a much bigger battle, one against sexism and racism. And they also faced many obstacles within their own movement. But we have to keep in mind that women got the right to vote, but not all women were able to vote, and that Native Americans and Chinese immigrants were not granted voting rights. Black women and Latinas couldn't cast their ballots until we had the Voting Rights Act 45 years after this was passed. So we're not going to ask for any comments here, but there were a lot of iffy things in terms of race, in terms of getting this amendment passed.
And I think it's worth noting it took 75 years to get this far.
Well, 75 years to get the amendment passed. And then
Right.
100 years later, and we still have a lot of battles to win.
Right, exactly. Well, I think we're going to need to move through these last slides quickly. We mentioned earlier about the lobbyists and corporations interfering with voting and pressuring people to get their vote. In the Women's Hour, you remember, I think it was the 6th floor, they had like a speakeasy type of room where any of the legislators could go any time of the night. There was whiskey all night long, as long as you were willing to listen to a lobbyist who was against the women getting the right to vote. They were afraid that they would ban alcohol sales, or they would tighten up the regulations on working employees. They would take away some of the ways that corporations were making profit. And we have the question, do you see any similarities in today's political environment? And I think we can all answer yes. If you'd like to put an example in the chat, go ahead and do that. Another industry that was lobbying besides the railroads was the textile industry. So there were power brokers who were against women having the right to vote.
Cindy?
No, I think we're going to move on. The Woman's Hour describes an important step in our country's evolution. By adding women as voters, we're doubling the citizens who can actually participate in the democracy. But we know there are many more steps we need to take. We just talked about the current voter suppression tactics, so there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure we the people includes everyone who's qualified to vote. And the suffragists touted the benefit of allowing women to vote by maintaining that women would improve things. They would clean up corruption in politics, and they would insist on better laws protecting families and children. So the question is, how have women voters actually improved our political system and perhaps our employment environment? So do we have anyone wanting to speak to that?
Karen Korsh would like to speak.
I think the women's argument, I'm trying to think, it was one of the antis, the one who helped get Barnard College started in New York.
Right.
I can't remember her name. She was the one who was very cynical about these arguments that the women's vote would change politics. And I think, I mean, us having the vote now shows you that it hasn't really changed politics much. So I think to say that women having the vote in general changes, you know, things as far as being more pacifistic or whatever, I think that's romantic, a romantic delusion. I feel like how she felt, even though I wouldn't have been an anti, I still feel like that argument was made for political purposes, and that, I mean, there are women who are pacifistic and there are men who are pacifistic. There are women who believe in equality and men who believe in equality. So I don't think that, you know, women are morally superior as far as the way that they tried to advertise it back then.
Well, Linda Reidman has written, research shows women leaders improve organizations and their management style is a positive influence. I think we all, everyone in this group would agree with that. Now, Barbara's talking about championing children labor laws and healthcare, and I do think women do that. But you know, if you go back and read about the antis, which is in the book that we just read, The Women's Hour, I mean, they wanted better laws in the same area. There's a lot in common in terms of what they did. They just had different ways they wanted to get there.
Cindy Graf would like to speak.
Cindy Grau.
Sorry. Yeah, I think the women leaders who have been elected focus on soft issues, environment, children, education. That's been proven. So it may not be women voters, although you see pandering to women voters now in different elections because they are a big block. So it's not a direct line. You can't point directly, but I think there have been huge changes made, and I think a lot of it, you know, is due to women's influence. We generally care about different things. You know, that's a gross generalization, but.
And I think you wrote something about soft issues, and that's important.
The climate, the environment, education.
Right. And women have been shown to make a huge difference in, say, a presidential election, because as a whole, we have those values. And if there's a candidate with those values, the women's vote as a bloc makes a big difference.
I think we better bring this to a close, Elaine.
Well, I want to raise this one last question to think about. Once the amendment was passed, only 30% of women voted. And we all know that we have sort of an abysmal record of voting as US voters, about 44%. So and think about the history of all these women and the things they went through to get the right to vote, and the civil rights. People died to get the right to vote. And some democracies even impose a fine for not voting. So I'd like you to think about this question. How can we increase voter participation? And we're not going to have time to talk about it, but that's kind of like, think about it, and what can we each do in our own sphere to increase voter participation. And the little chart at the top is showing that the lower your income, the less likely you are to vote. And that kind of ties in with voter ID and other things that suppress voting. If you can't take a day off, or you know, you don't live close enough to a polling place, it's a bigger issue if you are in a low-income job. So we hope you've enjoyed our tour of the last great fight for the right to vote with our cast of characters, and especially our heroine, Harry Burns's mother, who asked him to cast that winning vote. And Harriet, do you want to mention anything about?
Well, this is pertinent to Illinois only, of course, but
right.
The top two are League of Women Voters websites, vote411.org. And
the League of Women Voters would be nationwide doing this.
The Illinois Voter Guide is unique to Illinois.
Illinois, right.
And we just put a link here to DuPage County and Cook County. I think we may have other places represented.
Right.
But I'm sure this group that we have here knows where to go to get information. And there's been a lot of changes in Illinois. I think food for thought going forward. Before, I mean, it was many weeks ago, I think in the New York Times, Gail Collins wrote an article on 100 years of voting that hasn't done what we thought it would. And if you had an opportunity to read that, I think you'd enjoy it. And a question we're asking is, have you bought your stamps?
They just came out, but you don't want to wait till they're gone.
And then these other last two things, many references to the 4-hour vote program on PBS, but also the Thursday night after the Monday and Tuesday night of the vote was this program, By One Vote, Women's Suffrage in the South, and it just mirrors the book that we read for the Women's Hour. And it's the one that, well, I think you would enjoy it. It says here it expires 9/14. This was from Passport, but yeah, I'm sure it'll be around longer than that. And for some of you, grandmothers, mothers, great-grandmothers, whatever, there is now a young reader's book called The Woman's Hour. It would be a wonderful book for a gift for a young person. And that was a lot about what Elaine Weiss wanted to do. She wants to educate people on what the suffrage movement really meant. So.
Good. So Jennifer.
Thank you, Elaine and Harriet, and everybody who attended tonight. We enjoyed your participation in the discussion. We had a lot of people on here, and I think it went fine. And I hope you'll join us for our next programs.